Welcome back to Organist Launchpad. I'm Mark McDonald, and for our last segment, we're going to look at the accompaniment of Anglican Chant, one of the hallmarks of classic Anglican repertoire. So Anglican Chant is a way to set unmetered text by using simplified harmonic progressions and pointed text. This distinctive type of chant was formerly in widespread use in both Anglican and Episcopal churches, but today Anglican chant is sung primarily in Anglican cathedrals and parish churches that have retained a choral liturgical tradition. The chant itself, in its simplest form, is called a single chant. It consists of two halves. The first half begins with a whole note called a reciting tone, on which most of the verse's text is recited, and it's followed by a cadential progression of 3 chords. The second half also begins with a reciting tone, followed by a longer cadential progression of 5 chords. These single chants can actually be doubled to become a double chant, or tripled for a triple chant, etc. So you can go from having 10 chords in a single chant to 20 chords in a double chant, 30 chords in a triple chant, etc. By far the most common type of chant that we find in most psalters is a double chant, which has essentially 10 chords in the first half and 10 chords in the second half. We actually divide the double chant into 4 quarters. So you may hear me refer to the first, second, third, or fourth quarter of the chant. Allow me to demonstrate how a simple single chant works. So let's start at the very beginning. This is Psalm 1, as set by William Croft in the Royal School of Church Music Psalter. What we see here is that the text is divided with vertical lines at certain points in each verse. These vertical lines show us where the bar lines are. There's also a diamond shape at the end of every half verse to show us where the middle of the chant is. Text is sung closely to the way that it would be spoken and is largely unmetrical. Breaths are taken at the half verse and at the end of the verse, and longer lines of texts are broken by commas and often broken up with a small break. We wouldn't really call this a breath, but rather a break. So allow me to demonstrate. Blessed are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the assembly of the scornful. So there you have the construction of the pointing in the sung part of an Anglican chant. Let's see how this works with the organ. Let's start by talking about registration in psalms. Registration is much like in other choral settings. It mostly relies on softer stops or on expressive divisions where you can control the louder sounds of reeds and mixtures, etc. There is a great tradition among organists to word paint in psalms. This can be a very satisfying thing, but most sources on the performance of Anglican chant caution against elaborate use of effects for word painting. I have 2 really interesting quotes I would like to share with you, both from period sources. The first one is from Sidney Nicholson's Choirs and Places Where They Sing, which was published in 1932. Nicholson writes, "Such embroideries, if fashioned with taste, may be very charming. On the other hand, they may be extremely distracting, even though clever, and may destroy the beauty of the music altogether if they are clumsy." Another similar sentiment comes from the former Westminster Abbey organist John Frederick Bridge, who, writing in 1885, said this, "No doubt many of those who read this book may have heard organists portray birds singing among the branches, generally depicted by means of the shrillest flute in the organ. And the author has a vivid recollection of attempts to represent the heavens dropping and the words running very swiftly, the former by a startling staccato chord on the lowest octave of the great organ, while the right hand sustained the harmony on the swell, and the latter by a run up the keyboard of surprising rapidity. Ideas such as those would not, it is believed, occur to any organist of refined taste. He then continues, "It is, of course, impossible to deny that, within reasonable limits, an organist must be allowed to introduce special treatment suggested by the words he is accompanying, of which the best known and most obvious instance is that often accorded to the verse, 'Praise him with the sound of the trumpet,' seeing that with all the resources of a large organ at his command, he is, as it were, invited to orchestrate the music before him." So what defines these reasonable limits of word painting? In this psalm, one could imagine finding some fiery reed sounds for verses 4 and 5 in the chant, but one would not want to get too carried away. These need to, of course, be kept in context with things like the length of the psalm, the other colors that you use, also the size of the ensemble that you're dealing with. There are many different practices around where the organ should lift. In a single chant like this one, it would be advisable to not break at the half verse, but rather only break at the end of the chant before going to the next part. Allow me to demonstrate. Here I will start with a gathering chord in the manuals and then add the pedal note when I begin to sing. Blessed are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the assembly of the scornful. Notice how I carry through on the half of the verse, only lifting at the end of the verse. That being said, a common effect is to hold one or several notes over from the previous verse into the next verse, like this. Nor sat in the assembly of the scornful. Their delight is in the... Do you hear how in between the two verses I have added an extra note on the swell to carry us over into the next verse, to give us some momentum? This is just one way that we can add some variation to our accompaniment. There's no specific practice around these techniques, but they are often used for purposes of adorning the text or word painting. We're going to take a more careful look at this now by looking at a case study. In this case, let's go to a service at Christ Church Cathedral in Victoria to hear Psalm 72 being played by the Director of Music, Donald Hunt, and the Cathedral Choir. The organ starts with the gathering chord, adding the pedal when the choir comes in. This is a double chant, meaning that it has a total of 20 chords, which is double the length of a single chant. Now, instead of referring to each section as a half, the two chants create 4 distinct quarters, each with a cadence. Note also in verse 2 that the editor has chosen not to put a break between according and unto for a better flow of the speech rhythm. In verse 3, the organist uses a lighter registration on the swell, flutes 8 and 2, with a tremulant, and changes the voicing of the chord to be higher up on the keyboard with a descant line above the sung melody. In verse 4, the organist stays on the swell, but changes to softer 8-foot stops and adds the pedal line back in. He also chooses not to break between verses 4 and 5 to keep the momentum of the psalm moving forward. In verse 5, the organist improvises a descant line based on the alto part and highlights it with a solo stop in the right hand. The left hand covers the middle voices on the swell, and the pedal plays the bass line. In verse 6, the organist returns to the swell and adds extra notes in the form of chords on the great flute to highlight the drops that water the earth. In verse 7, the text is marked with the indication second part. This means that instead of going back to the beginning, the verse repeats the third and fourth quarters again. In this psalter, the editor has given general dynamic markings for each verse. So the forte here is realized on the organ with the swell up to the oboe and 16-foot borden, coupled to the great 8-foot flute and pedal. Now that you know some of these effects, let's listen to the rest of the psalm, observing the various adornments of the organist. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Anglican choral accompaniments. We've covered a lot in the last couple of videos: hymn playing, choral accompaniments, Anglican chant, but this of course just scratches the surface of what Anglican music actually is. I would encourage you to learn more about the whole Anglican tradition. You can do so with excellent books like Andrew Gant's Sing Unto the Lord, which is an entire history of church music in the Anglican tradition. You can also watch live streams of services from cathedrals and churches from around the world. Almost every cathedral in the United Kingdom has a live stream every Sunday, and of course many churches across Canada do the same. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me for the fundamentals of Anglican service playing on Organist Launchpad. I'm Mark McDonald.